why are we doing this thing? Are we doing this thing just to make money? If we're doing this thing just to make money, well, pretty much every classical tradition would tell you that's vicious and that's bad. And we need to get back to telling people, if you're going to do X, Y, or Z just primarily to make money, that is vicious, it is bad, it's sinful, whatever framework that person is going to listen to in that context.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
Today on the podcast, we actually have my husband, Zak Slayback, and Zak is a partner at 1517 Fund, and he's a regular writer and speaker on technology. He's also the author of How to Get Ahead about creating your own brand and professional network. And we have him joining us today to talk about the tech sphere, among other issues that he's been interested in lately, and talks to me about at home. So bringing some of the issues that animate our discussions to our audience. So thanks for joining us, Zak.
Sure. I mean, when I go to bed at night, I just think to myself, wow, I really wish everyone that listens to ISI's podcast could be at my dinner table and listen to what I talk about. Of course, I had to say yes.
Well, it's a dream come true, isn't it?
Before we begin our interview, I'd like to thank our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to help us in fulfilling this mission, be sure to rate this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So Zak, you gave a great talk for our George Washington Statesmanship program called How Tech Works. And I've listened to that talk because I don't know a whole lot about how tech works. I've got a few ideas about how, the doom scroll of social media is not good for my brain or my productivity, or how technology influences the economy, things like that. But I don't have a very deep understanding of to the macro questions that animate the discussions and concerns around tech. So maybe we start there. What are the things that we need to know about tech before we can have a deeper discussion?
Sure. I mean, I think that whenever we discuss tech, right, with quotation marks around it, there are a couple of distinctions that are worth making early in the conversation, largely so that we don't end up talking past each other, but also largely so that people don't end up making assertions that, if you really dug into them, they don't actually believe, they won't actually stand by. So I'd say that there are two broad sets of distinctions that I would make, and then inside of each of those distinctions, there are additional distinctions. So when we say tech, are we talking about a practical matter of the technology industry, or are we talking more about the intellectual matter of technology? And then if we're talking about the practical matter, oftentimes people say something like, oh, they'll find out, for example, that I work with a lot of tech, or I work with a lot of technology professionals, for example. And they'll immediately start asking for my opinion about, Apple or Netflix, Meta, Amazon, whatever, Google. And that's what I would call big tech, right? And when we're talking about those companies, those, Fortune 50s, Fortune 10s, whatever, those absolutely massive companies that have gigantic bureaucracies in them, and more or less get to operate as governments, without the monopoly on violence component. That's a very different thing than, say, a technology founder who is building a company in their garage with, 2 or 3 employees. So that's what I would call more startups. So we've got inside of tech, we have big tech, and then we might have what you consider little tech or startups. And then even within those, you might have what we think of as more like the traditional idea when a normal consumer would talk about technology, they might think of an app or something on their phone, maybe software they use at work, right? We would call that, B2B, business SaaS, or consumer software. And we might generally call that soft tech, or just generally software tech. And then the distinction further from that is we could then have something that would be more like the technology that allows your car to run, or the technology that allows you to be sewn up when you're stabbed from walking down the street in Philadelphia and you're taken to the hospital, and they don't actually need to rip open your entire body to, repair every part of you that has been punctured. We would call that hard tech. We also in that category could have things like energy, materials, technology, space, mining, industrials, a lot of the things that, quite frankly, we would think of as the more serious technology. So that's within the practical bucket of tech when we're talking about tech. And then there's what I would call more the intellectual or philosophical bucket when we talk about tech. And in that there are three different ways that this term is used kind of analogically. There is the concept of tech. There is specific technologies. It's very common that when you have conversations about tech, for example, that people will say, they might assert that they're, a Luddite. And then you really dig into it and it's like, okay, when you say you're a Luddite in the sense that the Luddites were Luddites, in the sense that they didn't like looms, so they smashed the looms. You're not a Luddite in the sense of how a lot of people use it in the sense that you hate all technology. You hate specific technologies. And we can talk about those specific technologies and what goes into them. And then there's what I would call like tech as ideology or technologyism. It's a little bit, I use the phrase a little bit differently than one might use, say, technocracy or a technocratic regime. They're related, not necessarily the same thing. So the concept of technology is a good thing. And one of the ways we can think about whether or not it's a concept or a broader bucket of goods or specific individual things is good or bad. One way that we can think about it just theologically is, well, would this have existed before the fall, right? And this is not an original idea from me. I credit largely, I think it's Andrew Willard Jones at Franciscan and Mark Barnes at New Polity have some great conversations on this. But technology probably existed before the fall. Adam and Eve are commanded to take care of the garden. And unless they're just walking around doing it with their hands all day, there would probably be some form of technology. Then we can think of specific technologies. Okay, well, specific technologies are traditionally considered morally neutral. It depends on how they are used. So, two examples that I would use that I think are other ends of the spectrum from a gut perspective for people would be a hammer, which we think of normally as a tool, and then a nuclear bomb, which is a bit more of a controversial example. But the hammer, is a neutral bit of technology. If I use it to pull a nail out of a, piece of garbage furniture that my wife had me go buy on Facebook Marketplace, it's good in that use, right? If I use it to, put a nail into a door frame for a door that is going to be in my home that takes care of me and takes care of my family, provides for the shelter and the common good of that society in which I live, my family, then it's being used towards a good end, right? But if I take that same hammer and I club my neighbor over the head with it, okay, well, it's being used towards a bad end, assuming I'm just murdering my neighbor. Or I use it to, go around and smash people's car windows, it's being used towards a bad end. And I would even say that something like a nuclear bomb can be thought of similarly. Now, the nuclear bomb, its genesis was to be used for a large event in which you would include the killing of civilians, and that is bad. But we don't judge these technologies necessarily based on their genesis. We judge them on their specific use cases. You could hypothetically, for example, use nuclear explosives for deep space mining operations, right? And in that application, it might be a good application of that technology. Being used against a civilian population, of course, that's an evil use of the technology, right? But the specific technologies themselves are neutral, and it depends on their application. Now, we could say that by introducing a technology into a context, it will bend the will or the incentives of the environment more towards virtue or towards vice. And that's where I think technology as ideology comes into the picture. And that is how, if we imagine the proliferation of a specific technology in a society, okay, does that then bend that society more towards a virtuous society or a vicious society? And then how do we view our relationship to technology in the world? There are people who, for example, will view almost any problem you come across as purely a problem of technology. Oftentimes, we have serious social issues that could be remedied or could be brought to a less serious state with certain advancements in technology. Absolutely. That is a very real thing. I don't think we want to view technology either as a panacea in the social context or as a completely vicious thing. But oftentimes in the technology as ideology or the technologyism framework, we look at a deep social issue and we say, oh, well, could we just throw new technology at it and solve that problem? I think two examples on social issues that are just very obvious would be abortion, and then from perhaps the other end of the spectrum, actually, euthanasia. On the abortion question, for example, I remember years ago, I realized how problematic for a lot of people the viability definition in the abortion debate is, right? That abortions may be legally permissible, if not even morally permissible, depending on who you're talking to in the debate, up to the point of quote unquote viability. Well, viability actually moves closer and closer to conception as technology improves. It's entirely possible to take a child today who's born at, say, 23 weeks, who a couple decades ago may not have survived that because the technology wasn't there to support that child's life. So you can see that throwing more technology at the issue doesn't actually solve the underlying issue, because you will run into people in that debate who will say, I don't care if the technology would allow a 3-week, 4-week, 5-week child to be considered viable. I still think that abortion should be legally permitted. Okay, this is a deeper problem and a deeper debate and deeper issue than purely a technological issue, right? So technology is absolutely important in the many prongs of that pro-life, anti-abortion stance. We absolutely should be advancing technological solutions, but it is not the solution to the problem. Similarly, you see this in the euthanasia debate. Somewhat surprisingly, actually, if you read early euthanagists, they're deeply anti-technology, because in their mind, you're going to take somebody towards the end of their life. They're more or less done with their life, however they decide what that means, because it's a very thin conception of autonomy and liberty that they operate by. You're going to plug them into a machine, and then they're going to live as a monstrosity or something like that. So they have this aversion to technology. But I think it's also a mistake to say, okay, this wouldn't be that big of an issue if we just had better technology that, say, reduced suffering at the end of life. That's absolutely an important component to that debate. And it's absolutely an important thing that those for whom that is their vocation, medical research, the advancement of certain biomedical technologies, they should be working on. But that would not solve the underlying debate and the underlying problem. So technology as ideology takes a very surface view look at a lot of social issues, says, we should throw technology at it, or we just need more technology, or how can tech solve this? Where tech's probably, there's usually one of two situations here. Either the situation was created by technology, because again, technology is neutral. It can actually create some very bad outcomes. Or technology is only part of the solution, and technology is ideology. So to recap, we've gone over a couple of distinctions here. We have the intellectual distinctions that we talk about when people talk about tech. I want to get clear, what are they talking about? Are you talking about technology generally speaking? Are you talking about specific technologies? Because oftentimes today when people say tech, they actually mean information technology, right? They mean the internet. They mean the smartphone. They mean the GPS. And that would all generally fall under what we would call information technology, which has certainly been the fastest progressing technology in our lifetimes, and probably ever. And then we have finally technology as ideology, where we think of tech as the solution to problems. And then there's the practical side of things. When people say tech, do they mean big tech? Do they mean the big technology companies out there that control a lot of what people see, a lot of what people eat, a lot of what people think about? Or do they mean entrepreneurial activity, right? Because certain circles, certain people you talk to, if you say, I work a lot in tech, they may actually immediately jump to saying, oh, so you work with startups, right? And that's distinct from big tech.
So take this in whatever direction you think is, would help our audience understand this, because obviously this is something we talk about at home all the time. But a few weeks ago, me and Zak went to the New Polity Conference out in Steubenville, which we live in Western Pennsylvania, so not too far from us. But I remember when we were watching a farmer, so we were on this farm was it attached to a convent, Zak, or?
It was like some ridiculous, very Catholic names, like the Franciscan Sisters of the Most Sorrowful Mother.
Yeah. Well,
it's a convent of Steubenville.
One of the farmers was showing us how he was milking one of his trusty cows, and this cow was on their farm for several years, and they really loved this cow, talked about the cow so endearingly, and they really had this relationship with this source of food for their family. And a comment that he made was, we could feed this country if we weren't so concerned with greed. These animals are producing food for us, but and it could be quality food too, but we're greedy, and we want to capitalize to a scale that is unsustainable if we were to do it ethically and at the they're kind of localists, so they're more in favor of these more ethical and the love that's poured into the stewardship, I think, of the land and of the animals really showed through with that comment from them. But it made me think about, and I think I talked to Zak about this, was how can technology how can we ethically use that and have it feed an entire nation? And especially as a household that is proudly seed oil free, obviously that we kind of pay a premium for our food because we want to source it from local farmers, and we kind of try and eschew some of those barriers that can prohibit a lot of people from accessing that food, such as having farms closer by, or other different types of these food startups and services that we've subscribed to enable us to get that food. So there's these things exist to enable the ethical use of technology to feed America. That's just one example that made me think about, especially with the kind of reactionary, I think on the conservative side of things, it's the phones, and I've seen so many pieces that are called literally yeah, it's the phones, or it's not this, it's the phones. And there is that impulse, and Zak, I know you've witnessed it as well. So I guess if you could talk a little bit about that homesteading, kind of that fringe part of the right that has emerged, and the connection and to technology, and kind of all how these subjects come together in your mind, being someone who does try to be a localist, does try to be small is beautiful in everything you do, while also viewing technology as something that can be good, isn't always bad. We're not absolutists. So yeah, it's kind of a word salad, but hopefully there's something there that you think that you can kind of talk more about.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and including on some things on which I'm not a topic expert, such as some of the intricacies of, say, industrial agriculture, right? But I think the agriculture example is actually an interesting one, because I am averse to technology as ideology, and I think you can look at any number of issues where viewing technology as your ideology can result in great horrors, right? A number of people have written on this topic: Ivan Illich, Pope Francis, C.S. Lewis and that Hideous Strength, Robert Hugh Benson, Lord of the World, right? This is a well-covered topic, and for people who think of more permanent things, right? At the same time, again, technology itself is not a bad thing. It depends on how it is used, and using our minds, using the reason with which we are endowed to solve the problems and to solve the problems we encounter and bring the world under our domain, so long as it is ordered in the proper way and to the proper end, is actually a good use of those things with which we have been given stewardship, right? Agriculture, or let's say industrial agriculture, has achieved some really great things, and that's being able to feed pretty much everybody, no matter how much money they make, pretty much with unlimited calories. But of course, obviously that has really serious downsides, often second order and third order downsides. A lot of those being that it concentrates a lot of wealth and power into a few companies. Public choice theory. There are a lot of public choice theorists who've written a lot on agricultural subsidies, for example, right? Each of us pays, whatever dollars per year to the federal government, negligible amount for us, that then is essentially put in a bucket and then given to the industrial agriculture lobby. So they have a huge incentive to lobby very, very heavily in favor of, say, like soybean subsidies or corn subsidies. It's why you find, corn oil or corn syrup in so many things. It's why you don't find American-made things that have actual cane sugar in them unless at a very significant premium, because the corn, which is used as the main input into high fructose corn syrup as a sugar substitute, is so heavily subsidized. So creates all these incentives for these large players to then lobby something like the federal government to then give an unfair advantage to them and make it much harder for the small local farm, right? It makes it much, much harder to go find a farmer who just has cows that they can butcher and that they can make a reasonable margin on it to support themselves and their family.
Also, if I may interrupt real quickly, remember that one time where we were buying organic products from that farm out in Paradise, PA, and they could no longer use the organic label? Is that an example?
I think that's another example of just like special interests, right? That there's all these certain credentialing organizations like the USDA Organic, and it just costs them so much in order to get the organic label that then, their gallon of milk, which already costs like $9 a gallon, would then cost something like $12 a gallon, right? It just was not economical for them. But it's super economical for, a mega milk consortium to be able to slap that label on something, right? So long as they just meet that criteria, which often is like a fairly narrow criteria, right? So the Dohertys, who are the couple you're talking about that we met in Toronto outside of Steubenville, they're big advocates of regenerative agriculture, right? And regenerative agriculture makes a lot of sense on a longer time frame when the incentives are set up in a way that you take care of the thing that you're looking at over many years. For a lot of these corporate industrial farms, they're maximizing for, oftentimes, it's quarterly shareholder profit, right? And this is a broader debate and discussion that can be had about some of the dangers of the short time frames on which what we might just call like shareholder capitalism forces organizations to think, right? So oftentimes people are thinking on much shorter time frames. They might be thinking on an annual time frame or on a quarterly time frame, and they're trying to beat something like the earnings per share estimate, right? And that makes them cut corners. Meanwhile, if you actually own the thing on which you operate, which the Dohertys do, or they've got a very close connection, say, to the Franciscan sisters at the convent, they are invested in treating that thing well over many years. So I think I think agriculture is a great example of technology as ideology gone awry. We applied a technology in a case where it made sense to apply that technology, but it has a lot of second and third order consequences. Industrial agriculture, car-based cities or automobile-based cities are usually another example that people will throw out there. I think a lot of the stuff around the phones. And I think these things are worth keeping in mind. At the same time, you alluded to something I do want to touch on, is you oftentimes meet people on the right, and I've met some very delightful ISI students, for example, and me in my slightly more unhinged moments can feel sympathetic to this worldview where it feels like we just need to get rid of all technology, right? And if you dig into that, it is usually that they're talking about a specific set of technologies. And usually it's information technology, but they're usually talking about a specific set of technologies. And the counterexample I would give is like, well, okay, if you have any family members, for example, who have suffered from like a blood cancer and survived, there's a very good chance that the advancements in technology that have been made relatively recently are the reason that they survived. Or I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who was explaining to me that there is a birth defect in which the baby is born without kidneys, and that this had a 100% fatality rate within minutes of birth, up until just a few years ago, where it became possible to more or less give the newborn dialysis upon being born. And that is a good example of a proper use of technology. It is a life-affirming use of technology that, yeah, we want to talk about what are the second and third order consequences of these things. In that case, I think it's the second and third order consequences are actually affirming a culture of life, whereas a lot of the negative technology applications that we think of in technology as ideology, they affirm what Pope St. John Paul II calls a technology of death, a throwaway culture, right? That's what comes to my mind in what you described. It's treating our goods, treating our neighbors, treating our food sources as throwaways. You can compare how somebody who is an employee of a publicly traded mega farm is going to treat a cow on that mega farm to how Sean and Beth Doherty treat the cow on the Franciscan Sisters convent. They're totally different ways of addressing these things. And so I think it's a good foil for pulling apart what are some of the issues we want to be thinking about.
Let me jump in, Zach, and ask maybe from I guess the idea of like technology as an ideology, or even sort of the way that technology interfaces with our politics and with our economy, the sort of balancing of the benefits that come with technology and also the risks and the drawbacks. I don't know. Obviously, I certainly agree that technology is neutral in a sense, but it does like sort of bend societies in one way or the other. So they are sort of ordered, or like I guess maybe technology itself, like the very concept of it, has certain orderings to change society. So like one of the, I guess, anti-conservative tendencies that I see in the idea of like not just particular technologies, but like what's common to each technology is that there's some form of disruption to the traditional way things have been done. And I think a great case in point of this is like the Amish. Their culture is sort of static, but it's largely cohesive and traditional because they've shirked off a number of modern technologies while still using some other forms. But even think about something like the agricultural revolution, like for the first time when man is able to settle down before so we have like man as hunter-gatherer versus agricultural man. That's a complete seismic shift away on the basis of agricultural technologies, even the most primitive ones. So like that'd be one thing. And I recall our episode with Jon Askonas from earlier this year when he talks about sort of the machine knows no tradition. Same thing as like the urbanization. We see this today. Like I'm from Boston originally, so that's a big tech hub, and that's the sort of modern technology. Of course, Silicon Valley, and sort of the problems of deracination, rootlessness that come with urbanization, the attendant loosening of morals. One of my favorite pieces of great literature is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's like one of the first pieces of literature that we have, and you sort of see this tension of urban man going out into the wilderness and destroying nature, and then you have Enkidu who comes and he's from the wilderness and he tames Gilgamesh and chastises him for some of his excesses as a king. But that's sort of getting a little bit off topic. And then of course, for the global marketplace, there's the issue of like mass immigration, which especially in a globalized economy. But we talk here today in our politics about how without immigration we won't have the ability to innovate, or how like a lot of more libertarian leaning people just make the case for open borders, which is, generally amongst social conservatives sort of anathema. And so how that can sort of, I guess, threaten a culture if the numbers are too big. But how do you sort of bear those costs? Or where do you draw the line as with respect to when the costs are unbearable or outweighing the benefits derived from tech?
Sure. I mean, when we analyze any kind of technology now, we're doing it in the rearview mirror, right? So we have all this information available to be able to say it looks like X, Y, and Z things were an effect of the proliferation of, say, the internet or information technology or the radio or all these other things. So hindsight's 2020. I would say, generally speaking, that we want to get very specific with the problems we're trying to solve with very specific technologies, right? And those problems need to be pretty serious problems, right? When we think about something like, say, there are certain problems that they can be created by technology, but once they are created, you don't put that genie back in the bottle. And I think this is, technology as ideology in general. Save a massive, conversion, like literal spiritual conversion of a populace. Once technology is out of the bottle, you don't really put it back in. Peter Thiel has a great essay from the mid-2000s called The Optimistic Thought Experiment. It's somewhat lengthy. You can find it over at the Hoover Institution. But one of the ways of reading that essay is that in a world of globalization and a world of advanced technology that allows for things like nuclear weapons, you essentially have two options available to you: further globalization or apocalypse. Right? Because when we find that when things deglobalize, we tend to get literal armed conflict over resources, right? And we can look at that and we can say, like, that's not how it should be. And I agree, that's not how it should be. But once you have that out of the bottle, it's going to be really, really friggin' hard on a large social scale to put it back in without, doing exactly what he knows is risking actual nuclear exchange, right? We can think of just the last couple of years, it seems like the world has pretty significantly deglobalized, and we have had more times in like the last year or two than I can count earlier in my lifetime where people seriously were talking about an exchange of nuclear weapons, right? Not on this scale of, immediately civilization ending, but on the scale of something like the use of battlefield tactical nuclear weapons. So once the genie's out of the bottle, we then need to look at specific questions. Say, like, okay, how do we solve these problems? A lot of these problems are actually solved through another form of technology we haven't talked about, which is social technology. There's soft technology in the sense of software, but then there's also soft technology in the sense of social technologies. How do we solve certain problems? Like a common law system is an example of a social technology that develops over time. There are examples of social technologies from the classical period, for example, that tend to get lost, the early classical period that tend to get lost until, say, the scholastic period, right? So we want to view technology simply as a hammer. Like, can we solve very specific problems? And we need to think very seriously about what are the second and third order consequences of not just solving this specific problem, but if many, many people solved this problem in this way, right? And that's a broader question of like, well, is that inherent to technology? Is scale inherent to technology? Because what you're describing to me, Tom, is more of an objection against scale than it is against a specific set of technologies even. Information technology. Is there something inherently problematic about the idea of being able to send a message, very, very quickly? Maybe not, but what about when it goes across the whole world to any other person? Okay, we can start to see the second and third order consequences of that may be negative much more clearly than if I needed to send a note up to someone across the street, right? So scale is more of a question, and it's a very closely related question to technology, because one of the things about more advanced technology, software in particular, which tends to be intertwined with information technology, is the cost to scaling it is very, very, very low. If I invent a hammer and then I want to, scale to 500 additional hammers, I am going to need to either build a hammer factory, or I'm going to need to take a lot of time to build each additional hammer. Software doesn't work that way, right? The cost to scale is practically zero. It's essentially just, server fees. Eventually, like DevOps engineers, manpower, but you can scale those things much faster. So then the question becomes, okay, if we look at a disruptive technology, right? Disruptive technologies tend to be those that scale very, very quickly, right? They tend to be related to information technology or electrical and computer engineering, generally speaking. And in those cases, yeah, I think the burden, the moral burden on the investor, on the innovator, on the employee is significantly higher. Why are we doing this thing? Are we doing this thing just to make money? If we're doing this thing just to make money, well, pretty much every classical tradition would tell you that's vicious and that's bad. And we need to get back to telling people, if you're going to do X, Y, or Z just primarily to make money, that is vicious. It is bad. It's sinful. Whatever framework that person is going to listen to in that context. I think even though we can kind of look at the immigration example is an interesting one, because if you read Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical on industrialism, there's an interesting assertion at the end of his section on the derivation of the natural right to private property, and then specifically the family's very strong natural right to private property that comes prior to the state's claim on property. And he says, if people have their own things and they can improve those things, and I would imagine they're improving those things through the use and development of technology, right? Yeah, it might be very simple technologies like a hammer, or like plans in order to take wood on a piece of property and turn it into a hermitage or a shed, but that's still a form of technology. One of the things he says is, if people can have that private property that is a function of their labor improving the productive property on which they were working, fewer people are going to find the need to leave their homelands and go elsewhere. Fewer people are going to find the need to immigrate. So it's one of these things where it's like the genie's out of the bottle. We want to think very practically on, can we improve the lot of people who are on the other side of the world in a place in such a case where they then don't find the need to then uproot themselves, move, and then introduce a new level of disruption, to take the phrase that you used, or creative destruction is kind of this idea that you hear thrown out there as well. And you can do that through technologies. I think people need to be much more discerning about their use of technology, though, of course. And the fact that's even kind of seen as like a weird, crunchy opinion of mine is evidence to just how deeply rooted technology as ideology is in post-industrial society.
Thanks. That's very helpful, Zach.
So we only have a few minutes left. So my last question is about, I know we've talked about this before, but something that you like to say is, it'd be great if we can put a bishop on Mars. And I think that, if you could expand on what you mean by that, and also maybe if that's at all, if you see that related to kind of the techno-optimism versus techno-pessimism debate. For a lot of our audience listeners, especially if they're if they're ISI students who perhaps aren't as plugged into the world of technology, especially kind of the spheres that exist in like Miami and Palo Alto, this might come off as a foreign concept to them, but maybe you can bridge the gap a little bit and explain what the distinction is between those two terms, and how, especially if you're a Christian, and specifically like we're me and you, Zach, are Catholic, how we can kind of have our forward-looking faith, and not the progressive sense, but rather hopefully that heaven-facing sense guide us in thinking about questions of technology.
Sure. There's a lot in there. I mean, I would neither call myself a techno-pessimist nor a techno-optimist. I would just say I'm a techno-realist, right? You do find a sort of techno-pessimism among you'll find in this certain eschatological framework where it's like we are imminently, in the end times, the only thing we need to do is like immediately save souls. And obviously that's one of the things that we're supposed to do, right? But that we can, throw everything else to the side and say we just need to get people saved, right? You can tell from that language, if you've had ecumenical conversations, it tends to be like a very highly Protestant idea that developed out of the late 20th century, right? I'm not an expert on that matter. You guys have talked to some people who are experts in that matter, and I can point people to their direction. But I like I said, neither a techno-optimist nor a techno-pessimist, just a techno-realist. We have time while we are here, and we are called to do certain things while we are here. We are going to be forced to make an account of how we used all of our resources, whether it is our financial resources, our technological resources, our intellectual resources, or our physical resources, all of those when we stand before the chair of judgment. So what does that mean? Okay, well, there's certain things we need to do. We need to feed the hungry. We need to clothe the naked. We need to give drink to the thirsty. We need to, visit the imprisoned, bury the dead. All of these things that can be done out there in the world, whether it's through the use of technology or not. So I joke that I'm like an eschatological maximalist, right? If there's one label I'm going to throw on myself, it's eschatological maximalist. I even shudder at things like, localist or any form of like conservative or whatever. But in that, I mean that we need to maximize for the theological virtue of hope, right? And maximizing for that theological virtue of hope does require us to go out and act as if what we do matters in the grand scheme of things, in the eternal scheme of things. So on the reference of like a bishop on Mars, I mean, I'd tell your students go read a Canticle for Liebowitz if they haven't already. And B, that no man knows the time or the hour. So we are called to extend the city of God and the kingdom of God to every end of the earth. And that includes every end of things off the earth as well, should that time come. We can have a debate about what is the practical use of space exploration or space technology. A lot of it actually tends to be second and third order benefits in a lot of cases that aren't directly obvious. But regardless, if somebody's going to end up with, Elon Musk is going to end up on Mars and he's going to be posting, memes about, goth girls or something, I want to make sure that there's some sort of spiritual direction for those people who are on that planet. A fun side fact is my understanding of the canon law is such that the bishop of any given extraterrestrial location is the bishop of where the mission that landed there launched from. So the bishop of the moon is the bishop of Orlando. The previous bishop of Orlando was a really big fan of that fact, and my understanding is the current guy is not as interested in that. But if we end up having someone land on Mars, whoever is in charge of that ecclesiastically. I mean, I can tell you, I think the vision painted at the end of A Canticle for Liebowitz, without providing too many spoilers for your students, is actually a really beautiful one. I've been making this technological realist case, this spiritual maximizing the theological virtue of hope case. And for years, people said, you just need to read A Canticle for Liebowitz. And I finally did. Highly recommend it. But at the very end of the book, for a reason that is evident when you read the book, the church decides that it is important to send missionaries off planet, and the job of those missionaries is to extend the mission of the church, in perpetuity until the end of time. And we don't know when that end of time is. So, of course, we shouldn't shy away from extending that kingdom off planet.
Well, I think we're out of time, but thanks so much for joining us, Zak. This is really helpful, I think. And for students listening or anyone else who's interested, we'll plug all of the book recommendations that Zak made in the show notes. And if there's anything additional or like places where you can find Zak, we'll also plug them in there. So Zak, just off the bat, is there anywhere that students should, or listeners in general, should be looking for your stuff, whether that be social media, elsewhere?
If they want the occasional link directly to my stream of consciousness, I am on Twitter. In fact, I would be willing to defend the claim that Twitter is actually, I wouldn't say that it's inherently evil, but I think it is satanic in a Sherardian sense. But they can follow me on it. I am still currently on it. That's at Zak Slayback. There's a link on my profile as well as my Substack that I think. And then they can email me at Zak, Z-A-K, at 1517fund.com or ZSlayback@gmail.com.
Great. Well, thanks again, Zak, for joining us. And thank you, listeners, for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to visit us at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.